I don't remember much anymore. That's the honest truth of it. 17 years will do that to a man. Take the edges off things. Soften the corners. Some mornings I wake up and I have to lie still for a minute just to remember what day it is, what year it is, whether the dream I was just in was something that happened or something I only wished had happened. But I remember her feet. That's what stays with me, clear as creek water, clear as anything I've ever held in my hands. Bare feet on the red stone of Red Creek's main street. Cuts across both heels from walking roads that weren't made to be walked without boots. Dust worked into the wounds so deep it had turned them the color of the earth itself, as if the land was trying to claim her one slow inch at a time. I remember thinking this woman has walked a long way to get here. I remember thinking, and nobody's going to let her rest. I'm writing this down because Asha asked me to. Not in those words, she's not one for telling me what to do directly, never has been. But last spring, she found the old journal I started the year I bought this land, and she sat with it on the porch for an hour, reading what little I'd written back then. When she came back inside, she set it on the table in front of me without a word, and went back to her horses. I understood. There are things that need to be written down before the man who knows them can't write anymore, before the hands get too stiff and the eyes get too dim, and the memory gets too kind the way old memories do, smoothing out the hard parts, making the pain prettier than it was, turning the people involved into something closer to legend than to truth. I don't want legend. I want truth. So I'll start at the beginning, or near enough to it. It was a Tuesday in July of 1874. I know it was a Tuesday because I only came into Red Creek on Tuesdays when the supply wagon from the Henderson store made its run out toward the eastern ranches. If I timed my ride right, I could pick up my order and be back on my land before the worst of the afternoon heat settled in. 17 years later, I can still tell you exactly what was on my list that day. New rope for the stable, the old stuff had frayed through in 2 places, and I'd been putting off replacing it longer than was wise. Box nails 2 pounds. A new file for the fence posts, and if there was money left after all that, which there usually wasn't, a small paper of tobacco. That was my life in those days, rope and nails and the question of whether there'd be tobacco. I want you to understand what Red Creek was like in the summer of 1874, because the town is part of this story as much as any person in it. A place has a character just like a man does, built up over years, shaped by who lives there and what they do and what they allow and what they look away from. Red Creek had been shaped by 17 years of hard sun and harder choices, and it showed. The main street was maybe 200 yards from end to end. Packed dirt, the color of dried blood, that particular Texas red that gets into everything, your boots, your clothes, the creases of your hands, and never fully comes back out. 2 rows of buildings facing each other across that dirt, most of them lumber gone gray from the sun. A few with false fronts that tried to look taller than they were, the same ambition, the same transparency. On the east side, Hooper's General Store, which was also the post office and the place where most of the town's serious gossip got its start. The Red Creek Hotel. 4 rooms and a smell that had been there longer than any of the current guests. The barber shop, the office of Dr. Miller, who had come out from St. Louis 12 years prior and had not forgiven Texas for not being St. Louis. On the west side, Morrison's land office, the biggest building on the street with real glass in the windows and a painted sign. The blacksmith. Mrs. Murphy's fabric and dry goods. The saloon, which had 3 different names over the years I knew it, but which everyone just called the saloon. And at the far end, the bakery run by the Martinez family, or what was left of it after the elder Martinez died, which was just his son and a daughter-in-law, and an oven that worked about as well as everything else in Red Creek, which is to say not perfectly, but well enough. That was Red Creek in July of 1874. The sun that morning was doing what the Texas sun does in July, which is to say it wasn't yellow, wasn't golden, wasn't any of the colors that people who paint pictures of the West like to make it. It was white, a flat, hard, merciless white that pressed down on everything like a hand on the back of your neck. By 10 in the morning, the shadows under the buildings were the only shade worth having, and by noon even those would be burned away to nothing. I'd ridden in just after 9, which was early for me. The road from my land took 2 hours at a steady pace, more if the horse was feeling stubborn, which my main horse, a gray gelding I called Nothing because I'd never gotten around to naming him sometimes, was. He'd been cooperative that morning. I took it as a good sign. I tied him at the post in front of Hooper's and went inside to check on my order. Hooper had most of it: the rope, the nails, the file. No tobacco. I hadn't expected it. Hooper said he was expecting a delivery from San Antonio by end of week and would set some aside if I wanted. I said that was fine. We talked about the weather, which in Texas in July is a short conversation because the answer is always the same and nobody needs to say it. I came back out and started loading the supplies into my saddlebags. The sun was fully up by now. The street had a handful of people moving through it. A woman from the Henderson farm, 2 of Morrison's ranch hands cutting across toward the saloon, a man I didn't recognize leading a mule with something heavy in its panniers. The regular morning traffic of a small town going about its regular morning business. I wasn't paying particular attention to any of it. Then I heard the voice. Not a scream, I want to be precise about that. Not an argument, not the kind of noise that makes your hand go to your belt out of instinct. It was something quieter, and in its own way worse. The tone people use when they want someone to disappear and they've already decided that person isn't worth the energy of real anger. That low, contemptuous dismissal that says you don't exist to me, and the sooner you understand that, the better for everyone. I turned around. She was standing in front of Hooper's store, which meant she'd been maybe 10 feet behind me the whole time I was inside, and I hadn't known it. Hadn't heard her. Hadn't been told by anyone that she was there. That last part that nobody had mentioned it told me something right away about how things stood. She was Apache. You could see it in the line of her face, the darkness of her eyes, the cut of the traditional dress she wore, which had once been finely made and was now worn loose over a body that had shed too much weight too fast. She was standing in front of the store with her hands clasped in front of her, not begging exactly, more like a person trying to hold their own posture together through willpower alone. She was speaking in Spanish, or trying to. The words were broken pieces of sentences that didn't quite fit together, but the meaning was clear enough. She was asking for food. She was asking for help. Hooper came out from behind his counter and stood in the doorway. I'd known Elias Hooper for 3 years by then. He wasn't a cruel man. I want to be fair to him even now, even knowing what he did that morning. He was a man shaped by the place he lived and the people around him by 17 years of listening to the particular fears and prejudices of Red Creek until they had become as natural to him as breathing. He didn't hate her. I don't think he felt anything toward her strong enough to be called hatred. He just wanted her gone. He didn't say a word. He made a gesture with his hand, one of those short, dismissive sweeps that means away, means remove yourself, means you don't belong in front of my door. His face was red, partly from the heat and partly from something else, something that looked like irritation, but smelled, if you were close enough and paying attention, like embarrassment. She stepped back. She didn't go. Instead, she turned, looked at the next door down the street, and walked toward it. I stood by my horse and watched. I don't know exactly when I stopped loading the saddlebags. I don't remember making a decision to stop. But at some point my hands went still and I just stood there and watched her work her way down the east side of Main Street, and I think I understood in some part of myself that I didn't examine too closely at the time what I was witnessing. The bakery was next. She knocked softly 3 knocks, the kind a person makes when they're trying to be respectful, trying to take up as little space as possible with their asking. The door opened. A young man, Martinez's son, who was maybe 22 that summer, and had the look of someone who had been told what to think and had decided it was easier than thinking for himself, looked at her, then looked past her at the street as if checking who might be watching, then shook his head, closed the door before she could speak. She stood there for a moment after the door closed. I could see her from across the street. She stood there and did something I have never forgotten and have tried in the years since to understand properly. She adjusted her posture. That's all. Just a small straightening of the spine. A breath taken in and let out slowly. And then she turned and walked to the next door. As if the closed door was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As if she had not walked days to reach this town. as if she had not just been turned away twice in 2 minutes. I understand it better now than I did then. Now I know that what I was watching was not stubbornness, not delusion, not the blind persistence of someone who doesn't understand their situation. It was something much more deliberate than that. It was a woman choosing consciously and with full knowledge of what it cost her to maintain her dignity in a place that was doing everything it could to take it from her. Every door she approached it the same way, softly, squarely, without pleading in her posture, without collapse in her bearing. But the body doesn't lie even when the will is strong. I could see from 20 yards away what the effort was costing her. The way her legs trembled slightly between doors, the way she had to put a hand against the wall of a building sometimes just for a second, just long enough to stabilize herself before continuing. The way her hands, which she kept as still as she could, had developed a fine, uncontrollable shaking by the third or fourth door. The blacksmith didn't even come to the door, just shouted from inside. I didn't hear the words, but I understood the tone. Mrs. Murphy came out of the fabric store and said something I could hear from across the street. I won't repeat it here. I'll only say that I've heard crueler things in my life, and I've heard far kinder. And what struck me about what she said was not the cruelty of it, but the casualness said it with the casualness of someone remarking on the weather. Just a fact. Just the world as she understood it. The woman who would become my wife did not respond to any of it. She looked at Mrs. Murphy once directly, one look, then she turned and walked to the next door. By the 8th door, she was leaning against walls between every approach, not just for a second, for longer, standing very still, eyes sometimes closing, as if she was making some private calculation about whether she had enough left to continue. By the 10th door she stumbled. It was a small stumble. Her right foot caught nothing, just the flat ground, just the stone beneath the dust. She caught herself quickly, straightened, walked on. But I had seen that kind of stumble before. I'd seen it in men after battles. In the hours after the fighting stops, and the body which had been running on something beyond ordinary endurance begins to give back what it borrowed. When the legs stop obeying the way legs are supposed to obey and start doing things on their own. When the body decides without consulting the mind that it has reached its limit. That stumble told me she had been without food for longer than a day, maybe longer than 2. The 11th door was Dr. Miller's. He came out when she knocked, looked her over with the expression of a man conducting a clinical evaluation, efficient, detached, the way he might look at a horse to assess its soundness. He let her get 3 words out in broken Spanish before he shook his head, stepped back inside, reached out and pulled the door shut. And then I heard this clearly, even from across the street slid the bolt. From the inside, something changed in her face when she heard that bolt. Her face held a different kind of breaking, quieter than tears, more absolute than collapse. Something that moved across her features like weather moving across open land. There one moment, settled the next, and you couldn't say exactly when it happened. She didn't walk to the next door. There was no next door. She had reached the end of the block. She turned toward the nearest wall, the side of a building whose name I couldn't even tell you now, and she did something that she had not allowed herself to do at any of the previous 11 doors. She let herself down. Slowly, with what control she had left, she lowered herself to the ground and sat with her back against the gray lumber. Her eyes closed. Her head dropped forward by degrees, the way a candle flame goes out, not all at once but incrementally, each fraction of an inch, a small surrender. And her hands, those hands that had worked so hard to remain still and composed through everything that morning, finally gave up. They fell to her sides and lay there in the dust, palms up open, like something that had been set down and wasn't sure it would be picked up again. The street had gone quiet in a particular way. People were still moving through the street, but the quality of their moving had changed the particular busyness of a community that has decided collectively and without discussion to be somewhere else in their attention. I looked across the street at Morrison's land office. He was there. He'd been there for a while. I understood that suddenly, the way you understand things that were true before you noticed them. Standing just inside his doorway, arms crossed, watching the whole of it with the expression of a man observing something he expected. Not enjoying it exactly, but not troubled by it either. His foreman Dutch stood beside him. I knew Dutch by sight, everyone in the county did. He was a big man with the particular look of someone who had found early in life that physical size was the most reliable form of authority available to him and had never seen any reason to develop another. Dutch was saying something. Morrison wasn't responding. I looked back at the woman sitting in the dust at the end of the block. I looked at my saddlebags half loaded. I looked at the gray gelding regarding me with the patient, incurious expression that was his default position on most of my decisions, as if whatever I decided to do next was fine with him, he'd seen worse. And then, though I didn't know it was a memory until it arrived the way the worst ones do, I was somewhere else. I was in the New Mexico Territory 10 years back in the late afternoon of a day that had started badly and gotten worse. I was 28 years old and wearing a uniform that I'd long since stopped feeling proud of, and beside me on the ground was a man named Thomas Elias Birch, who was the closest thing I had to a friend in a life that hadn't made friendship easy. Thomas had been hit in the leg bad enough that he couldn't walk bad enough that every time he tried to stand, the leg went sideways under him in a way that made something in my stomach turn. The unit was pulling back. The order had come down from the man who gave the orders. The man in the wide-brimmed black hat, the man with the calm voice, and the calculating eyes who I knew in that moment as Captain Morrison. "Walk coal, that's an order." "Walk coal, that's an order." Thomas looked at me. He didn't say anything. He was the kind of man who understood his situation clearly and didn't waste words pretending otherwise. He just looked at me, and in that look was everything acknowledgement, acceptance, and something else underneath both of those that I have never been able to name properly and have tried not to think about too often. I took one step back, then another. Then I was walking with the unit and Thomas was behind me, and that was the last time I saw him. We never found him. We never went back. We were told not to, and I was a man who followed orders in those days because following orders was easier than the alternative, which was deciding for yourself what was right and living with whatever came of it. I had been living with what came of it for 10 years. The memory released me the way memories do all at once, like a hand opening. I was back on the main street of Red Creek, Texas in the July of 1874. The white sun, the red dust, my half-loaded saddlebags, the gray gelding regarding me with patient disinterest, and at the end of the block a woman sitting in the dirt with her hands open at her sides. I looked across at Morrison's doorway. He was still watching, arms still crossed, face still holding that expression of a man watching something he had predicted and been proven right about. I looked at the woman. I thought, this time I will not walk in the other direction. I untied the gray gelding from the post, not to mount him, to lead him. I walked down the center of Main Street toward the end of the block, and the horse's hooves on the dry stone made a sound that seemed too loud for a Tuesday morning, too loud for a simple man walking a horse from one end of a short street to the other. But the street had gone quiet in that particular practiced way again, and in that quiet every hoofbeat rang out like something being decided. I was aware of the watching, the windows, the doorways, the people who had been going about their business and had now, without making any particular show of it, stopped going about their business. I was aware of Morrison. I didn't look at him. I stopped in front of her. My shadow fell across her face, not planned, just the angle of the sun and where I was standing, and shielded her from the white light pressing down. I watched her register the change in light behind her closed eyelids, watched the small adjustment of her features. She opened her eyes, slowly, the way a person opens their eyes when they are not entirely sure what they'll find when they do, and they need a moment to prepare themselves for whatever it is. She looked up at me, dark eyes, deep in the way that eyes get when they've been carrying weight for a long time. Not vacant. There was nothing vacant about this woman, not then, not ever in all the years I've known her since. But there was an emptiness in that look that I can only describe as the absence of expectation. She had stopped expecting anything from this street, from this town, from the people in it. She had not expected me to be standing here. I didn't say anything. I reached down and held out my hand. She looked at it. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count in 17 years of marriage and partnership and shared life on this land. I have tried to understand what she was looking at when she looked at my hand. I think, though I can't be certain, and she has never said so exactly, that she was not looking at a hand. She was looking at the decision the hand represented, the risk of it, the 1,000 ways it could go wrong, and the one way, the single uncertain way, it might not. In Red Creek in 1874, hands were extended to push, to point toward the exit, to close doors. They were not extended to help, not to someone like her, not by someone like me, not on a Tuesday morning in front of the whole observing street. She had learned that. She had learned it from 11 doors in the last hour alone, to say nothing of everything that had come before. Seconds passed. I kept my hand where it was. I have no particular virtue to claim in this. I wasn't patient by nature, never have been. I think I was simply very clear in that moment about the fact that I would stand there as long as it took, that I was not going to take the hand back, that whatever this cost me, and I understood, looking at Morrison's doorway in my peripheral vision, that it was going to cost me something, I was not going to take the hand back. The gray gelding shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose in the way horses do when they are waiting for something to be finished. And then she moved, slowly, with a caution that made something tighten in my chest, the caution of an animal approaching something that has never been safe and has no particular reason to be safe now, but that the animal is too tired and too hungry to walk away from. She raised her right hand, placed it in mine. She weighed almost nothing. I don't mean that as a way of speaking. I mean it literally. When I pulled, gently helping her to her feet, the weight of her was shocking. Skin and bone, the terrible lightness of someone who has been hungry for days. She swayed when she was upright, and I put my other hand on her arm to steady her, and I could feel the individual bones of her forearm through the worn fabric of her dress. She was upright. She was on her feet. She looked at me with those dark eyes, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything. Behind me I heard faintly the sound of Morrison stepping out of his doorway onto the boardwalk, the small sound of Dutch shifting his weight beside him. The collective held breath of Red Creek, Texas, waiting to see what happened next. I helped her to the horse. Carefully aware of every fragile angle of her, I helped her into the saddle. Then I mounted behind her, took the reins, and pointed the gray gelding toward the edge of town, toward the road that led east and then north, toward the 2-hour ride and the piece of land that was in those days the only thing in the world I could call mine. We rode out of Red Creek without hurrying. I didn't look back, but I heard it after we'd gone maybe 50 yards in the quiet that had settled over the main street like dust after a passing wagon. I heard Morrison say something to Dutch in a low voice. I didn't hear the words clearly. I didn't need to. The tone told me everything. It was the tone of a man who has just watched something happen that he had not planned for, and who is already, with the patience of someone accustomed to getting what he wants, beginning to plan what to do about it. The road opened up ahead of us, red and straight and empty, all the way to the horizon. We rode. When Red Creek was perhaps a mile behind us, when the town had shrunk to a cluster of gray shapes in the shimmer of midday heat, when the only sounds were the horses' hooves on the dirt road and the dry hiss of the July wind through the grass on either side, she said something. One word, barely above a breath. I almost missed it under the sound of the wind, but I didn't miss it. Asha. She was giving it to me. Her name. In the middle of that empty road, an hour after I'd done a thing that neither of us fully understood, yet she was giving me the only thing she had left that was completely her own. I held it for a moment. The weight of it, the trust in it, which was fragile and hard-won and more valuable, I was beginning to understand than almost anything else she could have offered. "Jackson," I said. The wind moved through the grass on either side of the road. The gray gelding kept his steady pace. And ahead of us, the land opened up wide and dry and full of everything that was about to happen. I am writing this by lamplight on a Thursday evening in October. Outside I can hear Asha moving around in the kitchen, the sound of her setting the last of the dinner dishes to dry, the particular rhythm of her in a house that has held both of us for 17 years now and has shaped itself around us the way a river shapes itself around the land it runs through. In a little while she'll come out here and look at what I'm writing and say nothing, because she already knows what I'm writing, and because she is not, and has never been a woman who says things that don't need saying. I have many more pages to fill before this account is finished, but I'll stop here tonight. The beginning is always the hardest part to get right, not because the events are complicated, but because what matters about a beginning is not the events themselves. What matters is what a man was carrying when the events found him, what he'd been carrying for 10 years, what he'd promised a dead man without knowing it was a promise. I'll pick up the pen again tomorrow. There is enough light left tonight to remember Thomas, and that's enough for now. The road to my ranch was never a pleasant ride in July. 2 hours of open Texas country, flat in some stretches, broken in others, where the land lifted into low ridges of red rock before dropping back down again into the grass. No shade worth mentioning. No water between Red Creek and my property line except for a small seep near the base of the eastern ridge that dried up completely by midsummer and was nothing more than a dark stain on the rock by the time July came around. I had ridden that road alone so many times that I had stopped seeing it. The way you stop seeing the walls of a room you've lived in too long. The land was just the land, something to cross, something to endure, something that stood between where I was and where I was going. That afternoon I saw it differently. I don't know exactly when the change happened. Somewhere in the first mile out of Red Creek, with Asha sitting in the saddle in front of me, her spine very straight despite everything, her eyes moving across the landscape in a way that mine never did. Taking it in, reading it the way you read a face you are trying to understand. She looked at everything. The ridge of red rock to the east, the dry creek bed that crossed the road about 40 minutes out. Nothing in it now but dust and the memory of water. The particular color of the grass, bleached nearly white in the open stretches, holding a little more green in the low places where the ground dipped and moisture stayed longer. The way certain plants grew in clusters around those low places. The way the rock changed color as the afternoon light shifted across it. She looked at all of it with the attention of someone reading a document written in a language they know very well. I watched her watching the land, and I thought, though it was only a dim thought, then the kind you file away without fully examining, that she knew things about this country that I did not, that she was seeing things I had ridden past 100 times without seeing. We didn't speak. I didn't try to make conversation, and she didn't offer any. There are silences that are uncomfortable, and silences that are simply the right thing for the moment, and this was the second kind. We were two strangers on a horse in the middle of a Texas afternoon, and talking would have been a performance of ease that neither of us felt. What I felt, if I'm being precise about it, was a low, steady uncertainty that sat in my chest for the whole 2 hours of that ride. Something closer to vertigo than regret. The feeling of a man who has stepped off a ledge and has not yet determined whether the ground below is closer or further than it appeared. I had done something that morning that could not be undone. I understood that clearly. The town had watched. Morrison had watched. Whatever happened next would happen in the context of those watching eyes and whatever conclusions they had already reached. I had known that when I untied the gray gelding from the post. I had untied him anyway. I was still not entirely sure what that said about me, but I was fairly sure it said something. We reached the ranch as the sun was beginning its drop toward the western horizon. The sky going through those colors it goes through in Texas evenings, the orange and the deep red, and then the purple that settles in over the mountains in the distance, like something being pulled down over the land for the night. My ranch was not much to look at. I want to be honest about that. 2 rooms of weathered lumber, sound enough, but nothing fancy. The boards gone the same gray as everything else in Red Creek County that spent too long in the sun. A stable for 4 horses, though I only had 2 at the time. A chicken coop that tilted slightly to the left, and that I had been meaning to straighten for 2 years. A water tank, a root cellar, and a garden plot that I had planted with optimism and maintained with neglect, which in Texas in July means it looked exactly like you'd expect. It was a working ranch. That's the most generous description. One man's operation sized for one man's life, which had been up to that Tuesday exactly what I had wanted it to be. I helped her down from the horse. Her legs gave when her feet touched the ground, not completely, but enough. I kept hold of her arm until I was sure she had her balance. She didn't thank me, and I didn't expect thanks. She stood on her own 2 feet and looked at the house and the stable and the tilted chicken coop with the same careful attention she had given the landscape on the ride out. Taking stock, I understood. Assessing. "Wait here," I said. I pointed at the porch steps. "Sit. I'll make food." She looked at me for a moment. Then she walked to the porch and sat on the top step with her back straight and her eyes on the mountains in the distance, and I went inside to start the stove. I am not a skilled cook. I want to be clear about that before I describe what I made that evening, because Asha has heard me tell this story in company once or twice over the years, and she has a particular expression she makes when I get to this part, a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth that means she is being polite. I made stew, dried beef and potatoes and 2 carrots that were slightly past their best everything into one pot with water and a little salt. It was the meal I made when I didn't want to think about what I was making. I'd made it 3 or 4 times a week for 3 years. 20 minutes later, I carried 2 plates out to the porch. I sat on the step below hers, not beside her below. 1 step down so that she had the higher position, the wider view, the choice of where to look. It was not a calculated gesture exactly. It was just what seemed right, what seemed to leave her the most space. I handed her the plate. She took it with both hands, held it, and then she did something that I have carried with me ever since, and that I can still see precisely when I close my eyes. She looked at the food for a long moment, the way you look at something you had stopped believing was real, the way you look at water after a very long thirst before you let yourself drink. "Eat slowly," I said, looking out at the horizon instead of at her. "If you've gone too long without food, eating fast will make you sick." She nodded, began to eat. Small, careful bites at first, deliberate and controlled. Then, as her body recognized what it was, receiving larger ones. I ate beside her and said nothing and did not look at her because I understood in some instinctive way. I couldn't have explained at the time that being watched while she ate was a kind of intrusion she didn't need from me on top of everything else that day had required of her. We finished. The sky had gone purple over the mountains. She set her empty plate on the step beside her and looked out at the horizon where the last light was fading. Then she turned and looked at me directly, the first time I realized that she had looked at me without the guard of immediate necessity, without the calculation of a person assessing immediate threat. Just looked. "Why?" she said. The Spanish was broken, but the question was not. "Why you help?" I looked out at the same horizon she had been watching. I thought about what to say. I am not by nature a man who talks easily about himself. 3 years of solitary ranching had not improved this. But she had asked a direct question and she deserved a direct answer, and I understood that the wrong answer here, the answer that was merely polite or merely practical, would close something that I did not in that moment want closed. "Everyone needs to eat," I said, "and this ranch is too much work for one man." I paused. And because I needed to do something right today. I needed to do it today specifically. I didn't explain that last part. She didn't ask me to. But I saw something shift in her expression, a small adjustment, like a door not closing as firmly as it had been about to close. We sat in the cooling evening air. After a while she said, "My tribe. They go north. New lands. I was sick fever. They know. They wait as long as they can." "But not long enough." She looked at me. "One man decide. Not whole tribe. One man." She said it simply, without drama, without the particular performance of pain that the story might have called for. Just stated it the way you state a fact about the weather or the condition of a road. This happened. Here I am. But her hands resting on her knees tightened slightly. I didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. The kind of hurt she was describing didn't need commentary. It needed acknowledgement, which is different. Acknowledgement is just letting something be true without trying to fix it or explain it away. We sat until full dark came down over the ranch and the stars emerged in the particular abundance that Texas nights offer, more stars than seem possible, more than the sky seems like it should be able to hold. Then I showed her the back room. I had been using it for storage tools, spare rope things I didn't have another place for. I spent an hour that evening moving everything out, swept it as well as I could, put down 2 clean blankets from my own supply. It wasn't much. A small room with one window, the lumber of the walls worn smooth with age. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. I thought she might say something. She didn't. She stepped inside, sat on the blankets. And the last I saw of her that night was through the small window. As I went to do the late stable check, she was sitting upright in the dim room, not lying down, not yet just sitting in the darkness with her hands in her lap, waiting for something or simply being. I couldn't tell which. I did the stable check, checked the water tank, walked the fence line on the near side as I sometimes did in the evenings, just to have something to do with my hands and my legs before sleeping. When I came back past the house, the window of the back room was dark. I went inside and lay on my own bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night, the horses shifting in the stable, the distant cry of something out in the dark grassland, the small sounds of lumber settling. A different sound now than it had been that morning. I fell asleep before I had worked out what to make of that. The days that followed had their own rhythm. I want to try to describe those early weeks accurately because it would be easy and wrong to make them sound simpler than they were. To describe a smooth progression from stranger to companion to something more as if it happened naturally and without friction, the version of events that gets told later after someone has gone through and removed everything inconvenient. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. She was wary. She had earned her wariness. Every morning for the first week she was up before me. I would come out to start the coffee and she would already be in the yard or the stable, moving through the early light with a quiet efficiency that told me she had not overslept, had probably not slept as deeply as she needed to, was keeping the particular vigilance of a person who has learned that rest requires safety and that safety is not something you can simply assume. She worked. I had told her the ranch was too much for one man, and it was true, and she seemed to have taken that as an agreement rather than an excuse, a transaction she understood the terms of. She fed the horses, collected eggs, helped patch a section of fence on the south side that I had been propping up with wire for 2 months. She was methodical and careful, and she didn't need to be told how to approach most things. She looked at a task, understood it, and did it. What she didn't do for most of that first week was talk. Her silence came from caution, not coldness. Words were a form of investment, a form of exposure, and she was not yet certain enough of the ground she was standing on to invest freely. I respected it. I was not a man who needed much conversation. But I watched her. I watched her the way you watch someone when you're trying to understand something without asking directly. And what I noticed more than anything else was how she moved through the ranch, through my ranch, with a quality of attention that I can only describe as recognition. Not familiarity exactly, not the comfortable ease of someone in a place they know. Something older than that. A kind of attention to the land itself, to the particular slope of the ground near the dry creek bed at the property's eastern edge, to the way the rock changed near the low ridge to the north, to the plants that grew where the soil was different, in some way invisible to me. She moved through my land like she was reading it. I didn't know what to make of that yet. The understanding would come later slowly, the way the deepest understandings do. It was on the 5th or 6th day, I don't recall exactly, only that the worst of her exhaustion had begun to lift and she was moving more easily, that I first saw what she could do with horses. I had a temperamental stallion, a big animal dark roan that I had bought at a poor price from a man passing through the county because the price was what I could afford, and the reason the price was poor was the reason I am now explaining. He was difficult, unpredictable in the way that horses sometimes are when they've been handled badly early in life and never quite learned to trust the hands that came after. He had no intention of hurting anyone. He simply had no intention of cooperating either. He tolerated me. That's the most I could say. That morning I came out to the stable to find Asha standing beside him. Just standing, close enough to touch, not touching, doing nothing that I had a word for. Her body sideways to him, not facing him directly. Her eyes not on his eyes, but somewhere around his shoulder and neck, a particular quality of not looking that was, I understood, somehow a different thing from looking away. The stallion stood with his ears forward, Not the tense forward of a horse that's about to do something you won't like, but the different forward of a horse that is paying attention to something that interests it. She said something, very quietly in a language I did not understand. 5 or 6 syllables, the sounds low and rhythmic, and as she said them she shifted her weight very slightly, and something happened with her breathing. I could see it from the stable door, a deliberate slowing, the kind of thing you do when you're trying not to frighten something. The stallion exhaled, lowered his head 2 inches, the tension in his neck and shoulders, which I was so accustomed to seeing that I had stopped registering it as tension released. She put her hand on him then, not reaching, placing the flat of her palm against his neck, slow and certain, and the horse stood for it the way he had never stood for me. I must have made some sound because she turned and saw me in the doorway. She didn't look embarrassed, just looked at me with that steady, measuring gaze. "How do you do that?" I asked. She considered the question. Considered, I think, how to answer it in a language that was not designed to hold the answer she wanted to give. "Apache," she said finally. "No, listen at animals. Listen with animals, they talk. Most people they don't hear. Can you teach me?" She looked at me for a long moment, measuring something. I had the feeling she was asking herself whether the question was genuine, whether I was a man who could actually be taught to hear what she was describing, or whether I was asking the way people ask about things they think sound interesting, without any real intention of doing the work of learning. "Tomorrow," she said. That evening we ate on the porch as we had been doing. The sky put on its usual performance. Somewhere in the second half of the meal, in the comfortable silence that had begun to develop between us, comfortable being a relative term, but more comfortable than the first night, she said something without looking up from her plate. "The man who left me." She stopped, started again. "I trusted him most, in my tribe. I trusted him most." I didn't say anything. "He decide I too sick, too slow, make tribe wait too long." She set her fork down on the edge of the plate. "He was not wrong. I was sick. I was slow." "That doesn't make him right," I said. She looked at me then. Something in her expression that I was learning to read, the slight adjustment that meant she was considering something I had said more carefully than I might expect. "No," she agreed after a moment. "Not the same thing." We didn't talk any more that evening, but when I went inside to bank the stove for the night and she was still sitting on the porch in the darkness, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. The wariness I had been watching all week, the vigilance, the careful measuring of every gesture and word, was not suspicion of me specifically. It was the specific, hard-earned wariness of someone who had trusted their judgment about a person and had been badly wrong, and who was now in the position of having to decide whether their judgment could be trusted again at all. That was the thing she was rebuilding, slowly, from the ground up, one small test at a time. I banked the stove and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about trust, about how it gets broken and whether it can be rebuilt, and what it costs the person doing the rebuilding, the enormous daily effort of it, the choice to extend yourself towards something that has hurt you before. I thought about what it would take to be worth that effort. I thought about the fact that I was asking her simply by being present to try again with a stranger in a strange place after everything that had already happened to her. I didn't think I was worthy of it yet. I thought, lying in the dark, that perhaps the most honest thing I could do was try to become worthy of it. It was in the 3rd week that Morrison came. I heard them before I saw them, the sound of 3 horses on the road moving at a pace that was not casual, the particular rhythm of riders who have a destination and a purpose and are not particularly interested in the scenery along the way. I was repairing the stable door, which had been hanging wrong on its hinges for a month and finally had to be dealt with. Asha was at the well drawing water for the afternoon. When she heard the horses, her body changed. It's the only way I can describe it. Something in her posture shifted. Something went quiet in her, the way things go quiet in animals when they hear something they need to assess before they react. She did not run. She did not hide. She simply became very still and very watchful. I set down my tools and walked to the edge of the yard. 3 riders on the road. Even before they were close enough for me to see faces clearly, I knew the one in the middle by his hat, wide-brimmed, black sweat stained around the crown in the particular way of a man who wears the same hat in all weather. I had seen that hat every day for 2 years once upon a time. I had taken orders from the man under it. I knew Morrison was going to come. I had known it since I heard his tone of voice talking to Dutch on the main street as we rode away. I had simply not known when. Apparently the answer was the 3rd week. He pulled up short of the yard and dismounted, which was the move of a man who understood the value of not riding directly onto another man's property without invitation. It created a certain fiction of respect that made the subsequent conversation easier to conduct. Dutch dismounted beside him. The 3rd man, someone I didn't recognize, younger, with the watchful eyes of someone who had been hired for his watchfulness, stayed mounted. Morrison walked toward me with the unhurried ease of a man who has always had time to spare, because time in his experience rearranges itself for him. "Cole," he said. "Morrison." I didn't move toward him. "I don't recall inviting you." "Neighbors don't need invitations." He stopped a few feet from me, close enough for conversation, not close enough to be threatening, or rather maintaining just enough distance to make the threat plausible. "Not when there's community business to discuss." "I'm not aware of any community business that involves my property." His eyes moved past me to where Asha was standing at the well. Something happened in his expression. Not contempt, not exactly. Something more complicated than contempt. A kind of recognition that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't immediately explain. "The Apache woman," he said. "People in town are talking." "People in town," I said, "can talk about whatever they like. That's one of the remaining freedoms." Dutch made a sound that was meant to be a laugh and wasn't quite. He said something about Asha that I will not write down here. His voice was loud enough to carry to the well. I moved before I was aware of deciding to move between Dutch and the direction of Asha, close enough to Dutch that he had to take a step back, or we were going to have a different kind of conversation than either of us had planned. "Watch your mouth," I said. "You're on my property." Dutch's eyes went hard. His hand moved toward his belt, not all the way. Just the beginning of the gesture, just enough to indicate that the gesture was available to him. Morrison raised one hand. Not urgently. The gesture of a man stopping a dog that is getting ahead of itself. "Easy." He looked at me steadily. "Cole, I know you're a stubborn man. You always were." And there it was. The thing I had been waiting for, the thing I had known was coming since the moment I saw his hat on the road. "You always were." "I don't know what you mean by that," I said, though I did. I knew exactly what he meant. Morrison looked at me with the patience of a man who has the rest of the day and knows it. "I think you do. I think you remember very well what we were part of, you and I. What we did. What we didn't do." He paused. "Some things sit better when they stay in the past, Cole. You start stirring old ground, you don't know what comes up." I looked at him. At the face I had followed orders under for 2 years of my life. At the man who had said walk, Cole, and I had walked, and Thomas had died. "Is that a threat?" I asked. "It's a reminder." His voice was even. "The town is restless. People are uneasy. An Apache woman on a white man's ranch there are those who are going to want to do something about that, and when they do, I might not be in a position to hold them back." "I never asked you to hold anyone back." "No." He looked past me again at Asha, and in his eyes was that complicated thing again, that recognition I couldn't name. "But you might want to start asking." He turned and mounted his horse. Dutch followed, still watching me with that hard, calculating look. The 3rd man had not moved the entire time. "Think about what I said, Cole," Morrison said from the saddle. "What we were, what we did, that doesn't just go away because a man moves to a new county and starts raising cattle. You know that." He spurred his horse and they rode back up the road toward Red Creek, the dust settling behind them in a long, slow cloud. I stood in the yard and watched until they were gone. Then I turned. Asha was no longer at the well. She had moved while my attention was on Morrison to a position nearer the stable instinct. I understood the instinct of someone who has learned that in dangerous moments You want something solid at your back." She was watching me. Her expression was very still. "You knew him," she said, not a question. "From another time." She looked at me the way she looked at land she was trying to understand, patient, unhurried, willing to wait for what the surface wasn't showing, looking for the information that wasn't in the words. "He has something on you," she said. It was the most directly she had spoken to me about anything personal since the night she told me about the man who left her behind. I looked at the road where the dust of Morrison's departure was still settling. "He and I said carefully, "were part of the same thing once, a long time ago. Some things happened that neither of us handled well." I paused. "He thinks that gives him a hold on me. Does it?" The question was quiet and direct, and it deserved a direct answer. "It used to," I said. "I'm less sure about now." She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the well and picked up the bucket she had set down when the riders appeared. I went back to the stable door and its hinges. The work was the same as it had been before Morrison arrived. My hands knew what to do with it, but the afternoon had a different weight to it now. Morrison had not threatened me with anything new. He had only named things that already existed, already pressed on me, already sat in the back of my mind in the particular way of things you carry without putting down. He had simply said them out loud, made them part of the air between us. He knew about Thomas. He knew that I knew that he knew. And he was reminding me that we were in some way that the years had not resolved, still standing in that afternoon in New Mexico, still on opposite sides of a decision that neither of us had handled the way we should have. The difference was that I knew it. I had known it for 10 years. I was not so sure Morrison had ever really let himself know it at all. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the ranch sounds and thought about Morrison, and thought about Thomas, and thought underneath all of that about Asha in the back room and what I had put her in the middle of by bringing her here. She had come to Red Creek looking for bread and safety. She had found instead a different version of the same problem. She had ridden away from a place with clear lines, drawn clear rules about who belonged where, and consequences for anyone who crossed them. I had not been honest with her about the size of what was coming. Not because I had lied, but because I had not yet fully admitted to myself how large it was. Morrison did not make empty gestures. He had ridden out here to say something specific and to hear what I would say back, and now he would sit with what he had heard and he would plan. That was who he was. That was who he had always been, a man who gathered information before he moved, who never moved without knowing where the ground was. I heard something around midnight that pulled me out of these thoughts. Not danger, just a sound. A small sound from outside the creak of the back porch boards under a careful weight. I lay still and listened. After a minute, quiet. I got up and went to my window and looked out into the yard. Nothing moving. Then I looked toward the porch. She was there, sitting on the back porch steps in the dark, not doing anything. Not looking at anything in particular, just sitting in the Texas night with her hands quiet in her lap and her face turned toward the mountains that were invisible now in the darkness, but there were always their dark shapes against a darker sky. I did not go out. I went to the stove and added 2 pieces of wood to the coals, more than the night required, so that the house would be warmer than necessary. Then I went back to bed. It was the end of the 2nd week when they came. I had been sleeping lightly since Morrison's visit. Not from fear, from the alertness of a man who knows when something is developing and hasn't finished developing yet. They came at 2 in the morning. I came awake not from a sound, but from the absence of one. The horses had gone quiet in the particular way that means they've heard something they don't understand. 4 shapes moved near the stable in the dark. I recognized Dutch by the way he carried himself even in darkness, that particular swagger that is the walk of a man who has never considered there might be other ways to move through the world. I grabbed the rifle, crossed the hall, knocked on Asha's door. It opened immediately. She was fully dressed, boots and all. She had heard the horses before I had. I understood that the moment I saw her face, which held no surprise, only focus. 4 men, I said. Dutch is one of them. She nodded. She already knew. We went out the back way. I could hear them at the stable door now, low voices, the sound of tools against wood. Dutch's voice, "Do the horses first. Turn them loose." 4 against 1 in the dark was not arithmetic I liked, and a shootout near the stable risked everything I was trying to protect. Then Asha's hand touched my arm. She pointed not at the men, but past them toward the far fence line where their horses stood tied in the shadow of the mesquite trees. I nodded. She was gone before I finished nodding. I have seen her move among horses many times since that night, but I had never seen it under those circumstances, 4 men 20 yards away, the stakes as high as they were. She moved like she was part of the darkness rather than passing through it. She reached the tied horses, stood among them sideways, breathing in the way she breathed when she was doing what she did with animals, leaned close to the nearest one and said something I couldn't hear. The horse pulled its tether loose and bolted. The other 3 followed instantly, all 4 gone into the dark hooves, loud and sudden. The horses, "Catch them." 3 men ran. Dutch stayed. He turned and found me stepping out of the shadow with the rifle up. "Long walk back to Red Creek," I said. "Tell Morrison the next time he sends someone onto my property after dark, I won't be interested in conversation." He didn't move for a moment. Then Asha stepped out of the dark and stood beside me. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Dutch turned and walked toward the road. We stood in the yard and listened until his footsteps were gone. Somewhere out in the black grassland, 3 men were trying to catch 4 panicked horses. Asha's hand was on my forearm. I became aware of it only then, the warmth of it through my sleeve. "The small horse didn't run with the others," she said quietly. "It came and stood beside me instead." I looked at her. "It chose," she said. Nothing more. We stood there in the dark yard a moment longer. Then she removed her hand, stepped back, and looked at me with those eyes that were doing the same work with me they did with horses reading something underneath the surface. "Go inside," she said. "I'll check the horses. They're fine." "I know. Go inside Jackson." It was the first time she had used my name that way. Just the name alone, a small, clean sound in the dark. I went inside. The morning would come. Morrison would plan. The town would wait to see what happened next. But right now, there was a woman on the back porch who was awake in the middle of the night and who had walked a very long way to reach a place that was still not sure it wanted her. And the smallest thing I could offer was that the house she was sitting outside of was warm. I lay in the dark and listened. Somewhere past the stable, past the fence line, past the dry grass and the red rock, a wind was starting to build. The kind that comes before something changes. The wind I heard that night was the beginning of the drought. I didn't know that yet. You never know the beginning of a drought. While it's beginning, you only know it afterward when you look back and try to identify the last day it rained and realize it was further back than you thought, that the dry spell you'd been calling temporary had quietly become something else while you were paying attention to other things. In the weeks following Morrison's visit, I paid attention to other things. The work of the ranch continued. Asha and I had developed by the 4th week something that I would not yet have called partnership, but that was closer to it than anything I had experienced in 3 years of solitary ranching. We moved through the days with an efficiency that surprised me. Not the efficiency of 2 people who have worked out an explicit arrangement, but the efficiency of 2 people who have begun to understand each other's rhythms well enough to not get in each other's way. She was up before me, always. By the time I came out to start the coffee, she had already been to the stable, had already checked the horses, had already done the small observational survey of the property. That I understood gradually was not habit, but practice. Every morning she looked at the land, walked the edges of it, read it the way I read the face of the sky when I was trying to guess the weather. I watched her do this and said nothing because I had learned that she would tell me what she found when she decided it was time to tell me, and that asking before she was ready produced nothing useful and cost something that I didn't have a name for yet, but that I knew was important. She taught me about horses. Not all at once, it wasn't that kind of teaching. It happened in pieces over mornings in the stable through demonstration more than explanation. She showed me how to approach the stallion, the angle of the body, the particular quality of not looking that was different from looking away. She showed me how to breathe differently in his presence, how to make my heartbeat, or at least the pace and quality of my attention, something the horse could read as calm. She said things in her broken Spanish that were approximations of ideas that didn't quite fit into Spanish, and I received them as approximations and tried to understand what was underneath them. "Horse, feel your inside," she said one morning. "Not your outside. Your outside say calm, inside say afraid. Horse know. Horse always know." "What do you say to them?" I asked. "When you speak to them in your language?" She considered this. "Not words exactly. More like I tell them what is true. Ground is solid. Sky not falling. You are seen." "You are seen," I repeated. "Most afraid things," she said. "Afraid because nobody see them. You see them really see, fear goes smaller." I thought about that for a long time afterward. Thought about it in contexts she probably hadn't intended, though perhaps she had. Perhaps she had intended all of it. It was in the 5th week that I noticed the well. It announced nothing. Bad things in the West, rarely do they arrive sideways in the peripheral vision, in the gap between what you were watching and what you should have been watching, not with a declaration, but with a subtle wrongness that takes a few days to become undeniable. The water level was lower than it should have been. I checked it 3 mornings in a row before I let myself think the word that I had been avoiding. In this part of Texas, in this particular summer, with the rain that had not come and the heat that had not relented, the word was not a small one. Drought. By the time I was ready to say it out loud, Asha had already been watching it for a week. "River," she said one evening, meaning the dry creek bed 2 miles to the east that fed the underground water table that fed my well. "River is not moving. I can tell from the plants." "What plants?" She gestured at a cluster of low shrubs near the property's eastern fence line. "Those. They drink from deep. When they start to look like that," she made a small downward gesture with her hand, "the deep water is going also." I looked at the shrubs. They looked the way shrubs always look to me, brown and dry and barely alive, the way everything in Texas looked in summer. She looked at me, looking at them, and said nothing. But I understood that she was seeing something specific, where I was seeing only the general condition of a dry summer. She was reading a language I didn't have. "How long?" I asked. "If rain comes soon, maybe okay. If rain doesn't come—" She paused, looking for the words. 2 weeks, maybe 3. 2 weeks. I looked out across my land, the land I had spent 3 years building. Something on the land that I was beginning to understand in ways I hadn't expected, not entirely mine to have built on, and I thought about what 2 weeks without water meant. For the horses, for the garden, for the ranch. I thought about the ranches to the north and west of me, the neighbors I knew by name, and not much else, the families I nodded to in town, and occasionally helped with fence lines when the work required more than one man. Their wells fed from the same table. If mine was going, theirs were going or would be soon. I thought about Red Creek, about the town that had closed 11 doors on a woman asking for bread, about what a town like that looked like when it got desperate. Desperate places, I had learned in my years of living in them, did not become more generous when they were desperate. They became more afraid. And fear, in my experience, always looked for something to blame that wasn't itself. I started digging. Not at the existing well. Asha had told me the existing well was tapping a source that was failing, and that digging deeper into a failing source was work without reward. She had told me there might be another source somewhere on the eastern edge of the property where the rock changed and the land dipped in a way that told her something. She hadn't told me this directly. She had said it in pieces over several days, in the way she communicated important things obliquely, allowing me to arrive at the conclusion alongside her, rather than simply being handed it. On the morning of the 6th week, I picked up a shovel and looked at her, and she looked at me, and she led me to the eastern edge, to the place where the red rock gave way to something darker, where the wild plants she had been watching grew in a cluster that had no business being as green as they were. "Here," she said. She put her hand flat against the rock face, moved it slowly, as if listening through her palm, then pointed at a spot on the ground 3 feet from the base of the rock. "Here." I looked at the spot, looked at the rock, looked at her. "How sure are you?" "Very sure." She looked at me steadily. "Grandmother, teach me. Land speaks if you know how to listen, same as horses." I picked up the shovel and started digging. It was hard work. The ground near the rock was compacted and threaded through with roots from the wild plants, and beneath the first foot the soil gave way to a layer of caliche, that dense, chalky hardpan that is the particular misery of Texas, digging the thing that breaks tools and backs in equal measure. I worked through it with the pick, then back to the shovel, then the pick again. Asha did not hover. She went about the other work of the ranch, coming by every hour or so to look at the progress, to check something I couldn't see in the quality of the soil I was bringing up. She would look at the dirt on the end of the shovel with the particular attention of a person reading evidence, then look at me, then go back to what she was doing. Around noon she brought water, and I stopped long enough to drink it and look at what I had done, which was a hole about 4 feet deep and approximately as wide, with nothing in it that looked promising to my eye. "Still right place," she said, looking at the walls of the hole with an expression I was learning to trust. "Soil changed color. See?" I looked. She was right. The soil at the bottom of the hole was a different color than what I had started with. Darker, by a shade so subtle that I would have put it down to moisture from my own sweat if she hadn't pointed it out. "Keep going," she said. I kept going. By mid-afternoon my hands had blistered through my work calluses, which told me something about how hard I was pushing. The hole was 6 feet deep. I was working by feel and faith at that point, faith in her reading of the land which I had decided to extend without reservation, because the alternative was to not extend it. And that felt in some way I couldn't quite articulate, like a different kind of decision with different kinds of consequences. By late afternoon I was exhausted in the bone-deep way that comes from sustained physical effort in Texas summer heat. The kind of tired where your hands keep doing the work but your mind has gone somewhere quiet and simple, just the next shovelful, just the next swing of the pick. I stopped at sundown. The hole was 8 feet deep. The soil was darker at the bottom, certainly darker than what I had started with, and there was something about the way it felt under the shovel, something slightly different in the resistance of it, but there was no water. I climbed out of the hole and sat on the edge with my feet dangling in and looked at Asha. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. Not apologetically, she didn't seem uncertain about the diagnosis, only about the timeline. "Maybe tomorrow." I nodded, went inside, ate what there was, fell asleep before full dark. I woke to a sound. Not a threatening sound, not the sound of horses on the road or voices in the yard. Something else. A rhythmic sound, steady and quiet, coming from outside and below the level of the window. I lay still and listened. Then I recognized it. The sound of a shovel in earth. I got up, went to the window, looked out at the yard, nothing. Looked toward the eastern edge of the property, toward the rock face and the hole I had dug. In the dark, a figure was working. No lamp, no lantern, just the thin starlight that Texas nights offer, and Asha standing in the hole I had left digging with the shovel I had left leaning against the rock. I watched for a moment, long enough to understand what I was seeing, that she had woken in the night and come out here alone without waking me, without asking anything, and had simply continued the work. That she had taken it on as her own work, not as an extension of mine. I went to the stable and got the pick. I walked out to the eastern edge, and she heard me coming. Of course she heard me coming, she heard everything, and she paused in her digging and looked up at me from the hole. In the starlight her face was composed and unreadable. I didn't say anything. I jumped down into the hole beside her. The hole was wide enough for two, barely. I raised the pick and swung it at the caliche layer that had reformed at the bottom during the afternoon, and the impact rang up through my arms and into my shoulders, and Asha resumed digging beside me. We worked in silence. An hour, maybe more. I lost track of time in the way you do when the work takes all of you, when there is nothing in your mind except the next swing and the next shovelful, and the sound of two people working in the dark on the same thing without needing to talk about it. Then my pick hit something different. Not rock, I knew rock. This was a different resistance, a yielding where I expected hard, and I swung again, and the resistance changed again. And then beneath my feet the soil shifted, compacted differently, and a smell came up from the bottom of the hole that I recognized without being able to name it immediately. Wet earth. The smell of wet earth in a dry land, the smell of what had been hidden, and was now by degrees becoming findable. I looked down. In the starlight it was hard to see clearly. I crouched and put my hand flat on the bottom of the hole the way I had watched Asha put her hand flat on the rock face. Pressed down. The earth was cold. Damp cold, not just night cold, the cold of something that had been shielded from the heat. And then as I held my hand there I felt it. Not a rush, not the dramatic surge of a man in a story who breaks through to a spring and gets drenched for his effort. Just a slow, certain welling, a gathering of moisture at the edges of the depression my palm had made in the soil. Water coming up the way water does when it has nowhere else to go and has found finally a path upward. I looked at Asha. She was looking at the bottom of the hole. Her expression was very still. Her hands, those hands that I had watched hold themselves steady through so much, were shaking slightly. Not from exhaustion, from something else. "You found it," I said. She looked up at me. "We found it." Quietly, definitively. The word from her own language, or one of them. I didn't know the language, but I understood the word the way you understand certain things, not through translation, but through the tone that carries them. We, us, both of us. We stood in that hole in the dark and watched the water come. Slowly at first, just the seep, just the gathering at the lowest point of the depression, and then faster, a genuine trickle, thin and clear and absolutely certain of itself, moving with the assurance of something that has been waiting a very long time to be found, and is not surprised now that it has been only resolved. I don't know how long we stood there, long enough for the water to reach our boots, long enough for the sky to begin its first lightening toward the east, that barely perceptible change from black to something slightly less than black that is the first announcement of Texas dawn. Long enough for the cold of the water to move up through my legs and into my chest, where it sat like something important, like something I would remember. We climbed out and sat on the ground beside the hole and listened to the water in the dark below us. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that the water wasn't already saying. After a while, Asha reached down and touched the earth at the edge of the hole, both hands flat, pressed against the ground, and she said something in a language I did not understand quietly, not to me, not to the night, but to the earth itself, a statement, a greeting, something with the quality of a long-delayed acknowledgement. I did not ask what it meant that night. I would find out years later. Before I found out what it meant, I would find out why it mattered that I didn't know, and that not knowing for a time was its own kind of understanding. News of water travels fast in a drought. I don't know exactly how it moved from my property into Red Creek, whether someone saw the work we'd done from the road, whether a passing rider noticed the difference in the water tank, whether it was simply the particular efficiency of small-town knowledge that always knows what it shouldn't before it can be explained. By the third day after we found the water, the first visitor arrived. Hooper. Elias Hooper, who had been the first door to close on Asha in Red Creek that Tuesday morning 5 weeks before. He came alone mid-morning with an empty water barrel on the back of a small wagon and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing what to say and has decided against all the rehearsed versions. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at me and said, "I heard you found water." "We found water," I said. He registered the distinction. Something moved across his face, not quite shame, more like the recognition of shame, which is a different, and in some ways, harder thing. "I've got family," he said. "My well's been dry 4 days." He was not asking for forgiveness. He was not asking for anything except what he needed, and that I had begun to understand was the honest way that real change often begins not with grand gestures, not with speeches, but with need, bringing people to doors they had previously closed. "Well's at the eastern edge," I said. "You know where the rock face is?" He nodded. "Take what you need." He drove his wagon to the eastern edge and filled his barrel without coming near the house. On his way out he passed Asha, who was working near the fence line. He stopped the wagon. She looked at him. He looked at her. He nodded once short, the kind of nod that is trying to contain something larger than a nod can hold. Then he drove on. She watched him go. Then she went back to the fence. I watched all of this from the porch and said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. More people came. The days had a rhythm now that was different from before, the regular work of the ranch overlaid with the steady arrival of neighbors I barely knew, each carrying the particular combination of need and embarrassment that the drought was producing. Some were easier about it than others. Some came in groups, which made the embarrassment communal and therefore easier to carry. Some came alone, which was harder. Ruth Henderson came with her 3 children on the 5th day. I was in the stable when they arrived. I came out to find Asha standing near the well and Ruth Henderson and her children standing 20 feet away, the children looking at Asha with the open curiosity of children who haven't yet learned to replace curiosity with assumption, and Ruth looking at Asha with something that was working hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. I started toward them, but before I had taken 3 steps, Ruth Henderson set down the container she was carrying and walked toward Asha. I stopped. Ruth stopped an arm's length away. Her face was doing several things at once. She was a woman who had called out cruelties on a public street 5 weeks ago with the casualness of someone remarking on the weather, and she was standing now in front of the person she had said those things to, and she was discovering what that felt like from the other side of it. She didn't speak. She couldn't find words that were adequate to the distance between what she had done and where she was standing now. She bowed her head, just slightly, the smallest possible acknowledgement, the minimum gesture that could be said to mean something while asking nothing in return. Asha looked at her for a long moment, long enough that I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Then she nodded back. That was all. No words, no embrace, no dramatic resolution. Just 2 women acknowledging that something had happened and that something else was happening now, and that perhaps the distance between those 2 things was navigable even if it was not yet navigated. Ruth Henderson filled her containers and gathered her children and left. The children looked back at Asha as they went. The youngest one, a girl of maybe 6, raised her hand in a small wave. Asha raised hers back. It was Hooper who told me a week later what had been said at the saloon the night I rode out of Red Creek with Asha. He told me on one of his return visits for water the particular timing of a man who has been carrying something long enough that the weight has become more trouble than the telling. "I want you to know," he said, leaning against the fence post, not looking at me. "What was being said wasn't right. What Dutch was saying about you, about why you took her." "I know what was being said," I told him. "Nobody thought—" He stopped, started again. "Nobody thought a man would do it just because it was right. That wasn't the assumption people made." "No," I said. "I expect not." "Morrison sat in the corner the whole night," Hooper said. "Listening, not saying much. You know how he gets." I knew how he got. "He was in there a long time after the others left," Hooper said. "Sam the barkeep said Morrison sat there until near midnight, alone, in the dark after the lamps went down." He paused. "I don't know what that means. Just thought you should know it." I thought about Morrison sitting alone in a dark saloon until midnight, thought about what a man sits with in the dark when the noise has gone away and there is nothing left but himself and whatever he's been carrying. I thought I understood it, actually. I thought it was probably the same thing I had been sitting with for 10 years. The same weight arrived at from a different direction. That didn't make us the same, but it made us something. Morrison came on a Thursday morning in the 8th week of the drought, 2 days before the rains finally broke. He came alone. No Dutch. No third man with watchful eyes. Just Morrison on an old horse in clothes that had the look of someone who had stopped caring about appearances sometime in the last few days. A different kind of solitary from the last time. He looked at the water channel we had built from the new well to the property's water tank, the simple clay and stone channel that Asha had designed and that we had built together in 2 days working from a logic of land and water flow that she understood and explained, and I executed. He looked at it for a long time. Asha was near the stable. She became very still when she saw him, but she didn't move away. She stood her ground with the watchfulness of someone who has assessed a threat and decided to hold her position rather than yield it. "Cole," Morrison said. "Morrison." He looked at the channel again, at the water moving through it, at the green that had started to come back into the garden plot near the house, the tenacious green of things that had been waiting for water and had not given up on it arriving. "I heard you found it," he said. "We found it." He looked at Asha when I said that, a long look. And then something happened in his face that I had not seen there before in all the years I had known him, a giving way small and controlled the way hardpan gives way when water finally gets under it. Not a collapse, just a shift, a rearrangement of something that had been held in one position for too long. "My cattle are dying," he said. "My wells have been dry 6 days." It was the hardest thing he had said to me in 20 years of knowing him. I could hear the effort in it, not false effort, not performance, but the genuine difficulty of a man who has organized his entire life around never being in the position of needing to ask. I looked at him. At this man who had given me orders I should not have followed, who had sent Dutch to my property in the dark to break what he could reach, who had stood on his boardwalk and watched 11 doors close on a woman asking for bread and felt nothing he was willing to name. And I thought not for the first time, not for the last, about the distance between what a person has done and what a person might still do, about whether those two things are always the same, about whether holding them as the same is wisdom or just another kind of blindness. I looked at Asha. She met my eyes. Her face was still the way it went still when she was thinking rather than feeling. Then she gave a small nod, not permission exactly, more like a recognition that the decision was mine to make and that she would not second-guess it. "Take what you need," I said to Morrison. "Bring wagons if you have to. The water's not going anywhere." He held my gaze for a moment. Something passed through his eyes that I could not read completely, was not sure I was meant to read completely. Then he turned toward the eastern edge where the well was. He stopped. His back was to me, to us both. When he spoke at the horizon, at the red rock face and the dark soil and the thin line of the water channel catching the morning light. "I know this land, Cole." His voice was different, lower, the voice of a man not making a speech but stating something he has needed to state for a long time. "I knew it before you came here. I know who was on it before the papers said otherwise." He paused. "I didn't think land held people that long." He walked to the well, got his water, filled the containers he had brought. On his way back to his horse he stopped once more, still not looking at either of us, looking at a point somewhere between us and the middle distance, the place where a man looks when he is saying something that costs him. "Dutch won't come to your property again," he said. "I'll see to it." He mounted his horse, rode away up the road toward Red Creek, the dust rising slowly behind him and settling in the still morning air. I stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats diminish. Then I turned to Asha. She was looking at the road where Morrison had gone, her expression unreadable in the particular way it went when she was processing something large. Then she turned and looked at me. "He changes," she asked. I thought about it, about Morrison alone in the dark saloon, about the weight in his voice when he said, "I know who was on it before the papers said otherwise," about a man who has organized himself around a set of beliefs for 50 years and the amount of force required to shift even the smallest of them. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but he came alone, with that old horse." I paused. For me, that's something. She held my gaze a moment longer. "Yes," she said. "Something." That night I couldn't write. I tried, and I couldn't. The words wouldn't settle, wouldn't find their order, kept sliding away from what I was trying to say into approximations that felt dishonest. So I sat at the table instead with the unlit lamp and thought about the word Morrison had used. Papers. the papers that said the land was mine. The paper I had signed without reading carefully enough, without asking the questions a man should ask when he is buying something that belongs to someone else, even when the law says it doesn't anymore, even when the law has been busy rearranging the definitions of belonging for long enough that most people have stopped questioning the rearrangements. I didn't think land held people that long. But Asha had touched the ground of my property and spoken to it in a language I didn't know. And when I found out what she had said years later on a different night from this one, the words had been, "Hello again, old land." Hello again, old land. Not hello, new place. Not hello, stranger's ground. Hello again. I sat with that in the unlighted room and thought about what it meant to buy something, to sign a paper saying it was yours, and to spend years on it, and come to love it, and then to learn that the thing you loved had been loved before, had been known before, had been spoken to before in a language that the papers didn't account for. I thought about whether that changed my right to be here. I thought about whether the answer to that question was yes or no, or whether it was something older and harder than either of those options. Whether the honest answer was that rights were one thing and responsibilities were another, and that I had been thinking too much about the first and not enough about the second. The lamp stayed unlit. The dark was useful tonight. From the back of the house I heard Asha moving, the soft sounds of her settling for the night, the familiar rhythm of her in the house that had been before she came only a house and was now something else that I didn't have an adequate word for yet. Home, maybe, or the beginning of home. Outside the wind was building again, but different from the first wind, the wind that had begun the drought. This one had something in it, a weight, a moisture, the first promise of what was coming. I went to the window and looked out at the night sky. Clouds, building from the west, moving fast, blotting out the stars in a line that was moving toward us, even as I watched. I stood there for a long time. The first drop hit the window glass when the clock, had I owned a clock, which I did not, would have read somewhere past midnight. Then another. Then several at once. And then the particular sound of Texas rain arriving in earnest, not the polite rain of gentler climates, but the full-throated, impatient rain of a land that has been holding it back for 2 months and will not hold it back one moment longer. I heard Asha come to her window, heard the small sound of it opening. I opened mine. We stood in our separate rooms with the rain coming in through the open windows, the smell of wet earth rising from the yard below, the sound of water on dry land, the most honest sound in the world. I have always thought the sound of something that was missing, returning to where it belongs. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the rain wasn't already saying. I write this in the dry season 17 years on, and outside it is warm and the horses are running and Asha is somewhere I can't see but can hear. Tomorrow I will write what came after the rain, the wedding, the years, the morning with the apples. But tonight I am thinking about Morrison and the old horse and the way he said what he said with his back to us, to the horizon, because some truths can only be spoken sideways. I am thinking about Thomas, about the afternoon in New Mexico and the order I followed and the man I left behind. I have carried him a long time. I think he is lighter now than he was, not gone, not resolved, just lighter. That is the most honest thing I can say about it. The rain is coming again tonight. I can smell it in the air, that particular promise. Asha smells it too. She always does before I do. Some things, no matter how long you live with them, remain remarkable. J.C., October 1891. The rain lasted 3 days, not the polite measured rain of a climate that knows how to ration itself. Texas rain, when it finally comes after a long absence, comes the way everything in Texas comes, without apology, without restraint, with the full force of something that has been held back longer than it wanted to be, and intends to make that clear. The dry creek bed 2 miles east filled in the first 6 hours. By the second morning it was running bank to bank, red-brown with the soil it was carrying, moving with the particular urgency of water that has places to be and has been delayed too long already. The garden plot near the house, which I had written off in the 6th week of the drought, began doing something I had not expected. It began coming back. Not all of it, but enough of it, the parts with the deepest roots, the things that had gone quiet rather than dying outright, waiting with the patience of growing things for the conditions that would allow them to continue. Asha walked the property on the second morning of the rain. I watched her from the porch, standing in it without a coat, moving through the wet grass with that quality of attention she brought to everything that had to do with the land. She stopped in several places, crouched down, put her hands in the mud and looked at what the water had revealed: the slope of the ground, the places where it pooled, and the places where it ran off the map of the property that the rain was drawing in real time. She came back to the porch with mud on her hands and her hair flattened by the rain and an expression on her face that I had not seen there before. Something settled. Something like completion, though. That is not quite the right word, because nothing was complete. Everything was still uncertain, still unresolved, still subject to what Morrison might or might not do, to what the town might or might not decide. But the expression was something like this: land is alive again. And underneath that something I would only understand later: this land remembers. I handed her a cloth for her hands. She wiped them without looking at them, still looking out at the property, at the rain moving across it. "It will be all right," she said, not to reassure me, not as a prediction about the future, more like a statement about the nature of things, about land and water and the relationship between them that existed before any paper had been signed by anyone. "Yes," I said. We stood on the porch and watched the rain. On the fourth day the sun came back. The land steamed. Everything that had been brown and brittle was in the process of reconsidering, not green, yet not recovered yet, but no longer resigned. The particular smell of wet Texas earth drying in Texas sun is something I have tried to describe to people who haven't smelled it, and I have never managed it adequately. It is the smell of potential, of latency made active, of things that were waiting becoming things that are happening. My well, the new well, the one we had dug together in the dark, was full. Not just adequate. Full, running over slightly at the edges of the channel we had built, finding its way down toward the low ground at the property's southern edge with the purposeful ease of water that knows where it is going. The visitors continued to come even after the rain. This surprised me initially with the drought broken. Their own wells would refill within a week or two, and the practical need that had brought them to my property would dissolve. But they kept coming, not all of them, not the ones who had been furthest from us, who preferred to let the distance stand, but enough of them that the eastern edge of my property, where the new well sat against its red rock face, began to feel less like the edge of something and more like the center of something. Hooper came twice more. The second time he brought his wife, who had never in 3 years of being my neighbor come to my property, and who stood near the well with a careful taking stock expression that reminded me uncomfortably of the expression I had seen on her husband's face when he first closed his door on Asha. She watched Asha work. This was not subtle. She watched openly with the concentrated attention of someone trying to solve a problem. Asha was mending a section of fence near the well, working with the efficient unhurriedness that characterized everything she did, and she was aware of being watched and did not acknowledge it, because she had decided, I understood, to let people see what there was to see and draw their own conclusions without her assistance. Mrs. Hooper watched for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she said to no one in particular, and therefore to Asha, "That's good work on the fence." Asha looked up, met her eyes. "Thank you." 2 words, clean and without excess. Mrs. Hooper nodded and went back to her husband, and they filled their container and left. It was not an apology. It was not forgiveness or absolution or any of the dramatic reconciliations that stories tend to prefer. It was a woman looking at another woman's work and saying so. But on the frontier in Red Creek County in the summer of 1874, it was a thing that cost something to say, and Asha received it as such, not warmly, not coldly, but accurately, as what it was. Caleb came on a Saturday 10 days after the rain, not with his family this time, alone on a small piebald horse that was too young for serious work, but adequate for a 10-year-old's Saturday morning ambitions. He rode up to the gate and stopped there, which was the respectful thing to do, and looked toward the yard where Asha was working with the stallion. She looked up and saw him. He raised a hand, not quite a wave more, in acknowledgement. The gesture of a child trying to behave with dignity in a situation that felt important to him. She raised her hand back. He dismounted and tied his horse to the gatepost and walked into the yard with the concentrated seriousness of someone on a mission they have planned carefully. He stopped in front of her. "I want to learn," he said, "about the horses, what you do." Asha looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved that small movement I had learned to read as the beginning of something warmer than her face usually permitted. "Today?" she asked. He nodded. She looked at the stallion, at the boy, at the stallion again. Then she walked to the fence and got the young piebald he had ridden in on the horse that was too young for serious work but perhaps exactly right for this work, and led him into the yard. "Start here," she said. "Start with what you came with." I watched from the porch as Asha showed Caleb what she had shown me, the angle, the quality of attention, the difference between looking at an animal and looking with it. He was a serious student. He listened with his whole body the way children sometimes do when they have decided something matters. The piebald stood quietly under his hand. Caleb looked up at Asha with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world contains a form of knowledge they had not previously known existed. That specific, irreversible surprise. She said something to him in her approximate Spanish. He nodded slowly, processing it. I went inside and let them work. Preacher Dodd came on a Wednesday morning near the end of the month. He came late in the day, later than everyone else, as if he had spent the daylight hours deciding, and had only arrived at the decision as the afternoon was giving out. He was on foot, which surprised me, which meant he had walked from Red Creek. 2 hours. In the August heat that the rain had barely moderated. He had an empty water container in each hand. He filled them at the well without speaking to anyone, which was his right and which I respected. Asha was working near the stable, and she watched him come and work and did not approach him. I stayed on the porch. He filled his containers, straightened up, and then he did what I had not expected. He walked toward Asha. She went still in that particular way, watchful, assessing. He stopped at a respectful distance. He was a man of late middle age with a preacher's bearing, the habit of physical uprightness that comes from spending a career trying to project authority through posture because the words aren't always sufficient. He looked at her. She looked at him. He did not speak. I think he had intended to. I think he had, on that 2-hour walk from Red Creek, prepared something. But standing in front of her with the afternoon light falling across both of them and the sound of the water moving through the channel and the horses quiet in the stable, the prepared words left him. He stood there for a long moment, long enough that it became its own kind of statement, long enough that the silence stopped being absence and became presence, the presence of a man holding himself accountable without the escape of language. Then he bowed his head, not deeply, a slight forward inclination, the movement of a man who is unaccustomed to the gesture and is making it anyway. Then he picked up his containers and walked back toward the road. I looked at Asha. She was watching him go with an expression I could not read completely, and I did not try. That Sunday Hooper told me later, much later in the way Hooper told me things when the timing and the company were right, that Preacher Dodd delivered a sermon about the Good Samaritan, that he preached it longer than usual and with less of his usual distance, less of the performance of authority. That when he finished he sat down in the front pew instead of standing at the door to receive the congregation, and that nobody quite knew what to do about that, and that a few people cried, though nobody admitted to it afterward. I wasn't there. I have never been a church-going man, and Red Creek's church had not given me much reason to start. But I was glad to know about the sermon, glad to know that Dodd, in his particular and insufficient and genuine way, had tried. Morrison kept his word about Dutch. I saw Dutch once more 6 weeks after the rain in the Red Creek saloon, where I had stopped for a drink on a supply run. He was sitting at the bar, not with Morrison's other men, just alone with a glass, and the particular look of a man whose circumstances have recently rearranged themselves in ways he didn't choose. He saw me come in. I looked at him. He looked at me. He turned back to his glass. I got my drink and stood at the other end of the bar and finished it and left. Nothing passed between us. Nothing needed to. The accounting was done. Not settled, not resolved into anything clean, but done. We both understood what had happened and what had not happened and what would not happen again. That was enough. I asked Asha to marry me on an afternoon in October. The leaves on the few deciduous trees on my property had gone the colors they go in Texas autumn, not the dramatic reds and oranges of the eastern forests, nothing that spectacular. More restrained. Yellows and pale golds, a quiet color change, subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention, beautiful enough that it felt private, like something meant for the people who were looking. I had made the ring from a horseshoe nail. I want to be honest about that. It was not a jeweler's work, not anything that would impress anyone who knew about such things. But I had shaped it carefully and smoothed it, and it had come out better than I expected, the way some things do when you work them with enough patience. She was near the new well when I came to find her. Doing nothing in particular, just standing in that way she sometimes stood at the well, not drawing water, not working, just being near it. I had come to understand that the well meant something specific to her that I was still learning the dimensions of. She stood near it sometimes the way people stand near things that have proven against the odds to still be there. I walked out to her. She turned when she heard me coming. I stopped in front of her, looked at her face, which I had spent 6 months learning, and which continued to teach me things, continued to contain depth I hadn't reached yet, continued to be more than I could read in a single looking. I knelt down. I know some men make speeches at this moment. I had thought about what to say, and had arrived by the process of elimination at the truth. I know our worlds are different, I said. I know this will not be easy. I know there are people in that town who will never. I stopped, started again. I want to build something with you, not just the ranch, something. I don't have a better word than something. She looked at me, kneeling in front of her in the dirt of the eastern edge of my property beside the well we had dug together in the dark. I want you to be my wife, I said, if you'll have me. The silence lasted long enough that I began to understand the specific quality of waiting, not the impatient kind, not the kind that doubts, but the kind that knows the answer will come when it is ready, and that rushing it would be the wrong kind of impatience. Her eyes filled, not dramatically, just a welling the way the water had welled up from the ground in the dark that night, quietly without announcement, simply because it had found its path. In my people, she said slowly, when a man wants a woman, he brings gifts. He shows he can provide. I looked at the well. She looked at the well. I found the water, she said. You just dug. That's true. But you dug all day. Something moved in her expression, warmth coming through in the particular way it came through in her, not soft, never sentimental, but real. Unmistakably real. And you came out in the dark to dig beside me when you didn't have to. I had to, I said. Yes, she said. That is why. She took the ring from my hand, looked at it, the rough-worked metal, the careful shaping of it, put it on her own finger slowly without assistance. Yes, she said again. I will be your wife. I stood up. We stood beside the well in the October afternoon, and I looked at her face and she looked at mine, and neither of us said anything more for a while because there was nothing more that needed saying, and we were both of us people who had learned not to fill silence that was already full. We were married the following Saturday. Preacher Dodd came to the ranch to perform it, which I had not expected. I had assumed we would go to town or find some other arrangement, and I had been prepared to accept whatever form the ceremony needed to take to be valid and real. But Dodd came to us, which was his way of saying what he couldn't say in so many other words. The sky that morning was the particular blue of Texas October, deep and clear, and so high it seemed to recede rather than arch a blue that made you feel the scale of things in a way that was either humbling or simply accurate, depending on your disposition. Hooper came. His wife came standing a little to the side and watching everything with that taking stock expression that I had come to understand was not coldness, but her particular form of attention. Ruth Henderson came with her 3 children. The youngest, the girl of 6, had brought a handful of late wildflowers. She held them out to Asha with both hands. No ceremony, no calculation. Children give things that way sometimes before someone teaches them to think about it first. Asha took them and looked at them and looked at the girl and said something in her language, and the girl looked up at her with the complete, uncomplicated attention of a child who is receiving something genuine and knows it. Caleb was there. He stood in the front and held himself with the serious dignity he had been practicing since the afternoon with the horses, the dignity of someone who has decided that this moment matters and intends to honor it by paying complete attention. We stood under the open sky. Dodd said the words. I said mine. Asha said hers in the careful English she had been building word by word through the months of that year, not fluent, yet. Not all the words she needed, but enough. Enough for this. Afterward there was food on the porch, nothing elaborate, just what people had brought, the frontier version of a celebration, which is everyone contributing what they have, and the result being somehow more than the sum of its parts. Hooper's wife sought out Asha at some point in the afternoon. I did not hear what was said. I was across the yard talking to someone else, but I saw the two women standing together for a few minutes, not quite comfortable, not quite uncomfortable, in the particular middle space of people who are beginning something they don't have a name for yet. That was enough. More than enough. The years that followed are not the subject of what I am writing, or rather they are the subject of everything I have written. The long outcome of that Tuesday in July, the answer to the question of what happens when a man decides to stop walking in the other direction. But they are not what I set out to record. I set out to record the beginning. So I will write about the end of the beginning instead, which happened on an ordinary morning 17 years later. The morning I have been sitting beside this whole time, writing around it the way you write around the thing that is hardest to put directly into words. It is October again. The same month, different year, different light. 17 Texas autumns have their own gradations, their own particular quality of low-angled sun and cooling air, and the sound of the horses in the morning. I was at this table early with the lamp still lit against the darkness, the journal open, the pen in my hand. Asha was outside. I could hear her, that particular sound of her in the morning that I have been listening to for 17 years, and that I can still hear more clearly than most things. Then a sound on the road, small hooves on the packed dirt moving at the unhurried pace of someone on a short errand, someone who knows where they are going and is in no particular hurry. I looked up. Caleb, not the 10-year-old who had come to the gate on his piebald and stood with serious dignity while Asha showed him about horses. The 27-year-old he had become, tall and weathered in the way of men who work outside in this country, with the hands of a rancher and the eyes of someone who learned early enough to still be changed by it, that the world contained more than it first appeared. He rode up to the gate and stopped, leaned down from the saddle and unhooked the latch and set something just inside. A basket. From the angle of my window I could see apples. Late-season apples, more than a basket load, really piled with the slight excess of someone who wants to make sure the gift is clearly a gift. He straightened up, looked toward the yard where Asha was working with the horses. He raised his hand. The same gesture he had used when he was 10 years old, standing at the gate on the piebald, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, a recognition. She raised hers back. He latched the gate and rode back toward Red Creek. No words, no ceremony. Just a man leaving apples at a gate on a Saturday morning because he had decided it was the right thing to do, and because 27-year-old Caleb no longer needed to understand everything about a decision before he made it. Some things you learn from horses. Some things you learn from watching other people choose over and over the harder of two available paths. Asha looked at the basket. Then she looked at me in the window. I raised my coffee cup. She shook her head. She has never liked coffee, not in 17 years, not once. Then she smiled. The smile that I spent 6 months working toward and 17 years not being able to look at without feeling that I had been given something I had no particular right to and that I intended to spend the rest of my life being worthy of. She turned back to the horses. I turned back to this page. I have been thinking about Thomas while I have been writing. I think about him often. That has not changed in 17 years. What has changed is the texture of the thinking, what it costs, what it means. For a long time, thinking about Thomas meant standing in the New Mexico afternoon in the moment of the order and the choosing. It meant the specific weight of having chosen wrong and knowing it and being unable to go back. Now it means something different also. Not instead also. Now it means that there was a Tuesday in July when I stood at the post with a horse and a half-loaded saddlebag and a street full of people looking away, and I made a different choice. Late, yes. Different context, yes. Not the same as going back, yes. But I made it. I do not think this exonerates me. I have thought about this carefully over many years, and I am not confused about it. One right act does not cancel a wrong one, and the arithmetic of conscience is not that simple. Thomas deserved better than he got, and what he deserved he did not receive, and I was part of that, and I will be part of it until I die. But I have also come to understand something that it took me a long time to understand, that carrying guilt is not the same as doing something about it, that the carrying by itself without the doing is a kind of self-indulgence, the luxury of feeling bad as a substitute for acting differently. I acted differently. Too late for Thomas. Not too late for the Tuesday in July, not too late for the 17 years since. This time I will not walk in the other direction. If I could speak to him, and I have spoken to him in the way you speak to the dead, which is without expectation of answer, but with the need to say the thing regardless, I would say, I kept the promise. Not the promise you needed, not soon enough, but I kept it. I think he would understand. He was that kind of man. The lamp has burned low. Outside, Asha has moved from the horses to the garden. I can hear her there now, the particular sounds of her in the garden that are different from the sounds of her with the horses, more abrupt, more practical. The garden being a different kind of relationship than the horses. The basket of apples is on the kitchen table. Later she will do something with them, a pie or preserves, or simply eat them as they are, which she sometimes prefers. Whatever she decides, they will be used carefully and entirely without waste. She is not a person who wastes what has been given. I am thinking about Red Creek, about the town that closed 11 doors on a morning in July and has been in the 17 years since in the slow and incomplete and sometimes retreating process of becoming something different. Not transformed, I want to be honest about that. Not saved or redeemed or made new. Just different enough in enough ways that Caleb could grow up in it and become what he became. That the daughter of Ruth Henderson, who used to bring wildflowers, is now a young woman who works in the Martinez bakery and who waves to Asha in the street without the wave costing her anything. Different enough that the distance between what Red Creek was and what it could be is shorter than it was, though still long. Still in places very long. I think this is how it goes. I think this is the actual pace of things, not the dramatic redemption, not the single moment where everything changes, and the music rises, and the camera, if there were a camera, would pull back to show us the changed landscape. Just the slow, daily, sometimes reversing, mostly forward movement of people trying to be better than they were. Failing sometimes, succeeding sometimes, getting up and trying again. That is enough. It has to be enough because it is all there is. I am going to close this journal today. Not because the story is finished. The story is not finished, will not be finished until I am. And even then, Asha will carry it forward in the way she carries everything, with a care and a patience that makes me think the world is in better hands than I sometimes fear. I am going to close it because I have written what I set out to write. The beginning, the choice on the street, the hand extended, the hand received, the water found in the dark, the name given on the road like a gift, like a small, irreversible act of trust. I have written about Morrison and Thomas and Dutch and Hooper and Ruth Henderson and Caleb and Preacher Dodd and all the accumulated weight of what people do to each other and what they owe each other on this dry and difficult and occasionally beautiful stretch of earth. I have written about Asha. Not all of Asha. She is not a person who can be fully written, and she would be the first to tell you that the most important things about her are not in any journal, are not in words at all, are in the way she stands beside a horse in the early morning, or the way she touches the ground of this land that was hers before it was mine. Those things do not translate. I have tried and I cannot do it. But I have written what I could. I will put the pen down now. Go outside. Stand in the October light that falls on this land that remembers, that holds what it has held, that does not forget the people who knew it before the papers said otherwise. Stand there and look at what 17 years of mornings have built. And then I will go find Asha, wherever she is on the property, and I will stand beside her without needing to say anything, because we are past the age of needing to say things to each other to know they are true. We will look at what we have. It is not grand. It is not the stuff of legend. It is 2 rooms added to a garden that produces in good years and struggles in bad ones, a stable with good horses, a well that has not gone dry in 17 years, a piece of land that holds us both. It is enough. It is, in fact, everything. I don't know who will read this, if anyone does. I don't know what Red Creek will look like in another 17 years or 50 or 100. Whether the slow and partial change will continue or whether it will reverse, whether the people who come after Caleb will be more like him or less. I know what I hope. I know what I believe is possible because I have seen it in Hooper's nod, in Ruth Henderson's bow, in Preacher Dodd, walking 2 hours to stand without words in front of a woman he had failed. In a boy learning to listen to horses. In an old man arriving alone with an empty barrel and leaving without the pride that had cost him more than any drought. Possible is enough. Possible is where you start. The rest is the daily work. Jackson Cole. Red Creek, Texas, October the 17th, 1891. Here the journal ends. The pages that follow are blank. In the margin of the final page in handwriting, different from Jackson's smaller, more precise, the handwriting of someone who learned to write in a language not their own and learned it carefully. There are 4 words: he dug all day. Nothing else. Nothing else was needed.